and also for you to be able to watch back. So yeah, thanks so much for joining this session on mindsets. Why don't I just start by talking a little bit about our guests and how I know them, and then I'll get them to speak a little bit about themselves as well. So I'll start with Michael. Michael and I met at GitHub Satellite a few years ago, a tech conference. And since then, we've been really fortunate to collaborate on our own venture, Techish, which is a top weekly podcast that covers tech news or news at the intersection of tech and culture. But Michael is an entrepreneur himself. So if you're not familiar with his media platform, peopleofcolourintech.com, you might be familiar with his recruitment platform, POCIT Jobs. Michael leads a remote team of employees, sales, editorial. Oh, Tiana uses Pocket, wicked. And as someone who has never raised outside funding, but has built a profitable 7-figure business, I just thought it'd be so great to have him on the show. And I feel that Michael is someone who has really built a business on his terms. He's these are my values. This is what I care about. I really admire the fact that you hire a lot of people from our community, people that haven't had that traditional path into tech. But I also really admire the fact that there are companies that you just won't work for if you don't agree with what they do. And yeah, I just think you're an entrepreneur that I admire because you never seem to have compromised on your values or even just your preferences, where you want to work, how you want to work. And despite that, you've still been successful. So I think it's really dope to have someone who's done it on their terms here. And then I just feel it's impossible to talk about mindsets without talking about the work that Tiwa does. Tiwalola, author of Confident and Killing It. I love how Tiwalola always reminds us that confidence is a muscle. And I feel that's true of anything, resilience and growth mindset. And my entrepreneurial journey, the way I've been able to show up has really been shaped by the content and the coaching that Tiwalola has put out into the world. So I just really wanted to bring her here. As usual, please remember that this is a space for you to get out what you can based on the stage that you're at with your journeys as well. So as much as I have some questions prepared for our guests, I also want you to unmute or jump into the chat and let me know what's front of mind for you. But yeah, if I could just start with my first question, I'm just going to jump into the deep end here. I'll start with you, Michael, then I'll come to Tiwalola. I want to start with limiting mindsets.
Yeah.
Because in last week's session on self-awareness, we spoke about how all of us are very aware of what we struggle with. We have a fear of rejection. We have a fear of saying no. And those fears have stopped us from pitching for certain things or putting ourselves out there. So maybe I'll just start with you, Michael, maybe just based on your upbringing, your background, how you ended up in entrepreneurship. What are some of those limiting mindsets, some of those beliefs you had or negative beliefs that weren't helpful, that now over the journey of entrepreneurship, you actually realized, you know what, I don't agree with that anymore. I have such a more positive mindset now.
By the way, that introduction was too flattering. I was like, who's that person? When are they joining the call? Yeah, so on limited mindsets, I would say even just getting started was difficult. So I had to confide in an entrepreneurial friend of mine who ran his own company. And I asked him, I said, I'm working in a startup right now. I'm an employee number 6. It's kind of good enough. I don't necessarily need to be an entrepreneur. I'm kind of learning. And he was like, well, that's not what you said to me at uni. You always said you wanted to be an entrepreneur. Then I said, well, I will just do 1 year here and then I'll start my company. And he said, why the 1 year? He said, and I said, because of my CV. I want my CV to look good. And he said, well, you're trying to be an entrepreneur. Why do you care about your CV? And I felt attacked. I was like, yeah, you're right. You got me. I was completely just BSing myself. I was looking for any excuse not to start. And from there on in, I basically handed in my resignation a week later. And then I got moving, basically. So sometimes even feeling you come up with all these excuses about why is now not the right time. There's always a reason not to do it. And you don't have to quit your job like I did. You can do something on the side and keep it moving that way. But just there are times when you're BSing yourself and you've got to kind of be willing to have a friend to either call you out and hear that it's not nice, or call yourself out, do some journaling, you'll figure it out. And then the second limited mindset was whether I was the right person to launch the community business that I launched. So when we launched POCIT, this is almost 7 years ago now, a relatively quite prominent person in the space who ran a large nonprofit that was helping underrepresented people in tech came out and said, oh, we don't need another community or organization to do with POC in tech. We need POC people in tech, but we don't need any more businesses about POC people doing things in tech. And I spoke to my co-founder and I was like, maybe she's right. Maybe we need to this ain't us. There's no need for this. And my co-founder at the time was like, no, like, F that, like, let's just keep it moving. Let's try. If we're gonna get rejected um, by the market, that's fair enough. If nobody wants what we're selling, but we can't let the voice of somebody relatively prominent just like push us down. And I always try to remember that moment because there's people that come to me when they're starting their company. And even if it's ain't the right idea for them and I don't necessarily believe in that idea, I'm always going to give them encouraging words and say things. So I think, how would I sum up that limiting mindset? Basically, just not feeling like you're the right person for this venture. Find out yourself, try. Like, don't listen to people who say to you, oh, that's not for you. Just somebody else could try this, or you're not the right person for this. And those are the two kind of limiting mindsets that kind of really held me back in the beginning, and I'm glad that I ignored them. And I recommend everyone do the same.
Nice. Thank you for that. Before I come to Tiwa, I just wanted to ask you what it felt like when you first saw that message from like a distinguished person being like, we don't need another tech community.
Yeah.
Because I can imagine sometimes when I feel doubt, even if someone just says like, oh, don't be doubtful, you'll be fine, it's not necessarily enough for me to get over that fear or apprehension. So I was just like, if you could just share a bit more about how you went from that feeling nervousness and apprehensive to actually committing to it.
I was gonna ask if I could swear, but basically I felt like like I didn't feel good. I was like, oh my Lord, let's just like pack it in. I DM'd my co-founder. She was based in the States and she was like, yeah, this ain't good. But we got on the phone and kind of just like gave each other a pep talk. She gave me more the pep talk because I was like, maybe this ain't right. And actually, where it was quite strategic is that my co-founder then went and messaged that person and said like, oh, we'd love to feature you in our website, our blog, basically, because we were a media platform first and foremost. And then the energy changed. Oh yeah, that's great. And we kind of made them like a semi-mentor at one point, but it was all kind of jujitsu. We kind of had to maneuver it and play to their ego. And unfortunately, that's a reality sometimes. If you're working in the industry where there's some heavy hitters, you do kind of have to like massage egos and get to know people. And even if your initial reaction is to be like F them and whatever, you kind of have to just do what you have to do to a certain extent. I know Abba gave this whole talk about my values, but sometimes you got to do what you got to do. And like, your initial instinct ain't always the right one. But yeah, it didn't feel good. Not whatsoever. And if I was a solo founder, maybe I might have tapped out and said, you know what, let's work on something else. But I'm glad that we didn't.
Nice. I feel like you would have still done it. I didn't think you would have tapped out. Anyway, okay, that's amazing. Tiwalola, I'd love to come to you with the same question. What are some of the limiting mindsets that you have had to overcome to become a better founder?
So I really relate to everything Michael said. Like in the beginning, for me, one of the biggest reasons, like I had already been working on my confidence for about 7 years or so before I actually became an entrepreneur. So I was already feeling pretty confident about the idea, but I was still kind of waiting for that external validation to rise to the top in the corporate world before then going to become an entrepreneur. And I was sitting down with a mentor and I was just talking about how like, oh, I need to be a director in the corporate world for people to take me seriously as an entrepreneur, so that's why I haven't quit yet. And she was like, okay, being a director for somebody else's company is cool, but actually, have you thought about how much cooler it is for you to build your own thing from scratch and build it to 6 figures, 7 figures, wherever you want to go that you started? And I was like, oh yeah, that's so cool. Okay. So it just took that little shift of like, you don't need validation from the corporate world before you can succeed as an entrepreneur. And of course, coming from a Nigerian background, I also wanted to prove to my parents and their friends that, oh, I could be a senior VP in the corporate world and be taken very seriously. But actually, being an entrepreneur and making my own money and running my own business is just as impressive as working in the corporate world. So that was my first one. And then my second one would be around my pricing. So just for a bit of background, I'm a confidence coach, I'm a life coach, and the UK market and the US market are very different. And for coaching and the prices that UK coaches charge versus US coaches are also quite different. And so I had that limiting mindset of like, oh, I've got to play it small because, you know, this is only what the UK market allows. And it was like, oh, if I wouldn't pay this much for coaching, then why would somebody else pay that much? But actually, you can't have that mindset because people have paid me amounts that I would never pay to somebody else. But I'm looking at it from my perspective. Actually, I shouldn't be doing that. I should be looking at it from somebody who has a real need to get coaching and a real need for change, and they will do anything to get what I am offering. And so I had to really challenge that limiting belief that I had to play small in terms of my pricing because, oh, I'm in the UK. And I would listen to US coaches talk about 6-figure years and like 6-figure months. And I'm like, hang on a second. And then I looked at my pricing and I looked at becoming a 6-figure coach. And I was like, this pricing isn't adding up for a 6-figure coach, right? So I just like increased all my pricing that was actually a better reflection of the transformation I was giving my clients.
That's really helpful. And I guess I'm kind of curious around like how long it takes some of these like shifts to happen, right? Because they're not overnight. And I just think because so many people in the room are really early, like the first year or 2 or 3 of their businesses, can you share some like context around like the timeline of starting to feel more confident, starting to feel willing to put your prices up?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I would say the first year, I was charging like absolute peanuts, like it was actually to the point of exploitation. And then when everyone just kept saying yes to me, then that was a sign like, hang on, you're too affordable if every single person you do a taster session with says yes to you, right? And so in the beginning, it was really exciting because I went from having no clients to having loads of clients. And the idea of having loads of clients was nice until I then experienced burnout. And I was like, hang on, something isn't right here. And so then I was like, okay, after every yes, increase your price. Right. And so it was getting those yeses that gave me the confidence, you know, hang on, I'm actually delivering something of value. People want it. There's demand. So let me just slowly creep it up and see how it goes. And so that's what I just started doing. So the first year it was like peanuts. And then after a couple of yeses, I was like, okay, let's add in another £1,000 here or another £100 here. And then I kept increasing it gradually until I was like, what's the scariest amount? And this was like 2 years after. I was like, what's the scariest amount I can charge right now? And I did it and I got my first yes. And so it was like, yeah, it took me about, I would say, 2 years of like slowly increasing my prices. And then I just did like a huge jump to like the other end of the scale.
Nice. And I'm just curious, Michael, when you eventually launched POCIT Jobs, your recruitment platform, so you've been doing the media for a while and you sort of built the audience. How did you then approach that gap? So like, how did you then get into the mindset where you're like, okay, we're actually going to go to businesses now and start charging for, you know, job ads, careers pages, whatever it might be? Were you charging the prices then that you charge now, or was that also a journey kind of like what Tiwalola was describing?
Yeah, it was definitely a long journey. A lot of what was said there I can resonate with. So obviously we hear that phrase, fake it until you make it. And that's within reason. We're seeing now a lot of public examples of people who faked it and they made it too far, basically. But in our case, we had a newsletter with probably about like 200 subscribers. So I said, let me go and find like 10 job postings around the internet that I think are from really cool companies and put them in our newsletter, and then have a link saying, like, if you want your job here, like, contact us, basically. And you could argue that we gave the false impression that those companies had paid us, because we're saying, if you want to be here, pay us, basically. And 2 or 3 companies like bit on that, and they were like, yo, like, how do we get featured? And I was like, $100. I just picked a number out of thin air. And they're like, yeah, where do we send the check? Or how do we pay you? And I was like, okay, we're onto something here now for real. Because I had previously done like an e-commerce business where I was like buying goods and like selling physical goods. And sometimes you'd buy something for $5 and you'd sell it for like $10. So someone gave me $100 for like a bit of text on a MailChimp newsletter. I was like, okay, we're onto something here. Let's go. And then going forward from then, we started doing like annual pricing, and even up until like 3-4 years ago, it was like $2,000 a year for an annual like unlimited bells and whistles package. And companies were saying yes too quickly. And I realized that, okay, we are slipping here and we're missing out on a lot of money. And then eventually Now we're charging like, you could get up to like 20, 30K if you really want the whole bells and whistles, right? So it all was done incrementally. It was done like bit by bit by bit. And then even my team, when I started hiring people, they were just like, some of them are on commission. So they're just like, yo, like, how do we make more money? Can we ask for this money? And I was like, all right, you guys try it. Go, good luck. Let me know how it goes. And they would come back and say, yeah, people are kind of on it at that price point. So yeah, it's been a journey, and it's a mistake that a lot of entrepreneurs make. My uncle's a tailor. He's got like a little tailoring shop, and he's always like, yeah, I'm like, you're charging too little. Like, stop thinking that you're not as good as Bob down the road. You can be. Like, why not? There's no reason like to feel insecure about charging what the market can bear. So yeah, it's definitely been a journey.
Yeah, and I guess I just wanted to ask, like, as a follow-up question, what's sort of that milestone moment that makes you realize you've reached a new level of business? Because I think for me, it was when we signed like the NHS as a client, because we deliver workshops. And up until that point, I feel that the maximum number of workshops that had ever been booked under one client was maybe like 10 or 12.
Yeah.
And then suddenly NHS came and they're like, we need 550 workshops. And I was like, holy shit, this is crazy. And because it was happening during COVID, when all of the conversations were happening around systemic racism in healthcare, I don't know, it just felt like this moment where I was like, wow, of all the companies in the UK that the National Health Service could go with, they're picking Hustle Crew. This is huge. And it wasn't just that validation, but it was also the capital that then came with that. That was our first 6-figure contract. And that was what allowed me to take on more consultants, promote people to senior consultant, like all these sorts of things that I always wanted to do in my business and I never could. So I'd just love to come back to you, Tiwalola, and then Michael. Were there any sort of like pivotal moments that then helped you realize, wow, time to elevate the mindset, really believe in the business now, increase the prices, or take bigger risks? Yeah, just curious.
Yeah, I would say, yeah, I think when I was getting like, I think it's for me was really like the feedback. So for example, when I did one workshop with, Meta, for example, like, and they came back to me and said, oh, my workshop was voted their employees' favorite workshop out of all of them, and then it's like Google initially booked me for one session and then came back for 4 more afterwards. It was like it was like, hang on a second, like I'm not even starting small. It's like my first ever corporate client was Deloitte, and then it just went bigger and bigger and bigger from then on. And so it was like I was just like, that whole fear of like, oh, can I, like roll with the big dogs kind of thing just like went out the window, because it was just like when you look at my portfolio of all the companies I've worked with, it's just like they're like incredible like multinational companies. So it just kind of like I didn't really have it, just like it was like big from as soon as it kicked off, and then it just kept going on and on and on. So yeah, I would say like, yeah, it was just like straight from the beginning that I realized, hang on a second. And then when I was getting the feedback and like when the CEO of like, I think it was OMD MG like posted me on her LinkedIn like saying what an incredible workshop it was. It was like I deserve to be in these rooms. Like I know what I have to offer, and I don't, because I think oftentimes we look at like people in the corporate world as like, oh, they work for Google, like, oh, they must be so smart, or like they're so this and so that. And then I'm like, oh, this little entrepreneur who's trying to like help them. And actually it's like, no, like they look at me and they're like, oh my gosh, this woman that's coming to our organization and is like changing our lives. Like they are just everyday people who just work at like big brand names. And it's remembering the humanness to people that really has helped me. It's like, yeah, okay, it's a big brand, but at the end of the day, this person at this huge company that usually I would be worshiping is coming to me to help them solve their problem. So actually I'm the big dog in this situation, and I need to like own that and take up space in that way.
I love that. What I like about that is that you were able to see yourself through their eyes, and that helped you then recognize your value and your worth. And I think so many of us need to do that. Like a lot of us have become desensitized to like the followers we have on social media or the number of people that read our last blog post. And I think it's really just a reflection of the times we live in. Like the fact that people follow our journeys or care about our work or engage with our stuff is because they see us at a level that they aspire to be at, right? Or they want to gain something from us. They're inspired by us. And I do think more and more of us need to see ourselves through the eyes of our followers, of our blog readers, of the people engaging with us, and use that to validate our confidence and our positivity. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Michael, curious if, again, there was any particular moment or milestone along the, POCIT journey that made you realize, damn, okay, time to elevate the mindset, time to like really own where we are now in our journey?
I think, like it wasn't necessarily like a dollar amount, but you'd see like Nike signed up to the job board. I don't think they even posted, but I was like, Nike, however you want to say it. I went to the Nike store as a kid. Like these are the corporations that like are made up your childhood, and you know what I mean. So it was always like, okay, little old me with my laptop. I didn't have a team. I didn't have an office. Still living at mum's house. Do you know what I'm saying? And I'm here just building something. And someone at Nike is signing up. And yeah, it's just to reiterate what was said. Like these people at corporations, they're just people. Like they're not, they're just normal human beings. And if you've worked in a large corporation, probably that's not necessarily the most amazing insight in the world. But to me, who's only ever really worked at startups, when I started engaging with these companies, it was just like, okay, they're just people just like me, flesh and blood. Like they need something I can provide. Let's work together, basically, and see if we can do something.
Yeah, amazing. It is really exciting when that moment happens, whether you're like selling directly to customers or selling to businesses, someone that you admire is valuing what you're creating. There's a real sense of reward in that. So yeah, I really like that. Okay, so my next question is switching to the more positive side of the spectrum, because I think we've all sort of acknowledged that there are like limiting mindsets we had, whether it was around the price that we can charge, the type of company that we can partner with. I'm curious, maybe I'll start with you, Michael, and then I'll come to Tiwalola. Like, when you now think of your most productive weeks or your most productive moments, those times where you're like, I have really bossed this as a CEO, I'm so proud of myself. What do you think were the qualities or characteristics of the more positive mindset you had in those moments, in those weeks when you absolutely bossed it? So I'll just like use myself as an example. Times where I really feel like I was bossing it, I was being a very effective leader, and I had the mental resilience to get me through that moment. I think I was thinking things like, even though this is difficult and uncomfortable, it is just like one short moment on a longer timeline. So like that was kind of one of the things I had. Or like other times I've just thought about, if I can get through this hour, if I can get through this meeting, if I can get through this day, like taking a crazy week where I maybe had to like make someone redundant or whatever, like just taking each moment step by step helped me have a positive mindset instead of being overwhelmed and anxious about like how much there was to do. So yeah, those are probably like a couple of things that come up in my mind, the qualities and the characteristics there being focusing on the long term, and breaking big challenges down into smaller achievable pieces. But yeah, I just kind of like to hear from you what has, formed those more positive mindsets. Like if you were to actually like distill them into a tactic or a strategy, you say?
I think the weeks that go well, the ones that kind of begin on Sunday night, which isn't really the fun thing to say, but essentially if I get to work on Monday and I haven't necessarily planned out like my thinking for the rest of that week, I'm kind of already playing catch up. So you can either do it at Friday before, the work day ends, but I try to do like Sunday when I'm kind of winding down and like, hey, what am I trying to do this week? What sales are we trying to get? What do I need to tell the team? And then I use a thing that's called the Eisenhower matrix. It basically is like a 4x4. Everything in business is 4x4. Like 4x4 this, 4x4. Anyway, it's like important, urgent, non-important, non-urgent. And then I try to tackle the stuff that is important but non-urgent. That's the key. So stuff that is super important, but it can wait. So for example, on my any given week, what's non-urgent but important is improving the product, coding, building features, taking customer feedback and building it. But that can wait because there's always a daily firefight. Oh, this customer's complaining, or there's someone saying this about this article, or any millions of things that can happen that my team can kind of like buzz me on. So it's about prioritizing the week ahead of time, and then also establishing what is important but non-urgent. What are the long-term, what are the things that are going to keep you going for the long term that you need to invest in today, basically. And then beyond that, obviously just the boring stuff, like looking after myself, exercise, walking, sipping my green tea, those little things there. That's what gets me into the right state of mind to kind of tackle things. I would also say reading. So a lot of the stuff that you mentioned about, like, mindset, I've just ingested it so much via the books that I've read and the things that I've done that it kind of comes second nature. Like, control the controllables. Like, do what you can with what you have. And if it's anything beyond that, then there's no point. Don't worry about it, basically. And then also that it's a cliche, and obviously I got a quote Nipsey Hussle, but it really is a marathon and not a sprint. And the people that I've seen burn out are the ones who, like, they don't kind of make it. Like, there's no point having this great business if you're just going to burn out, because you're either going to fail or you're going to have to sell it at a suboptimal price, and you're going to, live with regret. So take care of yourself as well is kind of important.
Nice. Yeah, I really like that. And I actually think when we are at our most stressed or busiest or most challenged times is actually when we need to double down on that stuff the most. Like, I'm the kind of person where it's like, if I have a week of speaking engagements coming up or whatever, I'm like, right, okay, so I'm getting up early that day to go to that 8 a.m. yoga class. So I've done something for myself before that madness starts. Or, okay, I booked a massage like right after the last one ends. So I've got, things that I can do. But yeah, I think that's like really, really helpful. Tiwalola, I'd love to ask you the same question. When you think of the mindset that got you through some of your most successful moments as a leader, what were the qualities and the characteristics there that, what was happening mentally and also literally to allow you to stay positive, stay productive?
Yeah, so I actually really like working. So it's just, for me, it's just the joy of seeing progress and, ticking boxes. I have an addiction to ticking boxes. Like, sometimes, even if a task is already done, I will still write it on my to-do list just to get the satisfaction of ticking that box. So I think for me, just seeing progress and movement and, going through, like you said, baby steps of all the things that I said I was going to do, makes me feel good. But what even makes me feel even better is because I like working so much, for me, it's really easy for other things that I also enjoy to just get pushed to the back burner completely. So, for example, the way, and I write about this in my book, Confident and Killing It, I think in chapter 4, when I talk about productivity and procrastination, is actually that I align my to-do list with my top values. Because what I noticed before was, like, because I love the work that I'm doing, I'm so passionate about it, it's really easy for me to focus and pour everything into it. But then I begin to neglect some of the other values that I have, and then I end up feeling unfulfilled, even though I've done a lot. So I realized that my top values are impact, creativity, wellness, and spirituality. So if I spend my whole week just doing stuff that's impact worthy, but I've left creativity, I've left spirituality, I've left wellness, that is not a good week for me. On paper, it might look super productive, but actually, to me, productivity isn't just about ticking boxes and being in meetings for hours and hours. Productivity is about spending time doing what matters to you. So the first thing in terms of feeling good and positive is to identify what matters to you. Right. And to me, what matters are my top values. And so I've made sure that my week is a reflection of my top values. So it means not missing my Pilates class in the morning because, oh, I know today's going to be a busy day, push to the side. No, I'm not doing that anymore. I'm going to the class, and whatever happens can wait until the class is done. It's making sure that on Sundays, like, I make it to church and I'm not saying, oh, I'm too tired, I've worked too hard this week, I just want to lie in, and things like that. So it's designing my life in a way where all the things I care about are woven together. And in a podcast episode with my mom, we actually talked about work-life balance versus work-life integration. And we don't believe in work-life balance because you're already doing 5 days versus 2 days. There's no balance there. And so what we do is work-life integration, where I design my week based on all the 4 pillars that I feel give me fulfillment. So there's a little bit of rest, there's a little bit of work, there's a little bit of creativity, and I'm weaving my life together. And then it moves from a to-do list to like a get to-do list. Like I get to show up for work, I get to exercise, I get to express myself creatively. It's not things that I have to do. It's like I get to do it. And that shift from like, oh, I've got to do this, to like I get to experience living my life in such a full way, I feel has really like helped me throughout the week. Now it's easier said than done, I know, but it's just like at least having that framework in mind, like, okay, what am I doing this week? And you schedule in rest, you schedule in your wellness, you schedule in your creative tasks. And so that way you're kind of touching on all the different areas of your life.
I love that. That's brilliant. And I can see that resonating a lot with the group. And the reason I really liked this idea of like a thematic week, or rather recognizing what drives you, what gives you energy, all these sorts of things, and making sure that there's time for them throughout the week, is we actually did this exercise last week in terms of identifying our strengths. And as you were speaking, I was like, let me just pull up my strengths quiz. So this is something that all of the founders did last week. And what I find really interesting is that just looking at my own thing, I've also tried to design my week according to these things that give me energy. So for example, every day and night, I do my gratitude journal. So it's 3 minutes in the morning, 3 minutes in the evening. And when I stop doing my gratitude journal because I'm busy or I'm sick or like whatever, like I genuinely notice the difference in my mental health. The gratitude journal, just as a journaling exercise, also helps me get perspective, which is like another thing that's really important for me. I also try to read fiction every night. There's always a book by my bedside table, whatever, Kindle. And then it's so funny because like, oh, appreciation of beauty and excellence, like how is that something that you build into your routine? But I always try and like go for a walk in the park before I start my day, or during lunch, so I can just like look at the birds and like look at nature. Or if I have a meeting near Tate Modern, I'll like go an hour early and like actually pop in to an exhibition. And weeks where I genuinely have those themes, you know, broken up and integrated into my day are weeks where I have a very positive mindset. I'm able to bounce back from setbacks really effectively. And no matter what's happened in the week, I just end it feeling a general sense of fulfillment and achievement. And when I drop out of that habit, I just start to really run myself down. So thank you so much for sharing that. And
can I share something quickly on the importance of like negative and positive mindset, especially when it comes to like your work and productivity? So a lot of people think procrastination is because you're a lazy person or whatever, but actually it's not. So it's scientifically proven that your thoughts lead to your feelings, and your feelings lead to the actions that you take or don't take. So a quick exercise, if everyone wants to do this with me, it's to think about what's something you're procrastinating on right now. Okay, think of a task, activity that you're procrastinating on. And I want you to think about what are the thoughts and the feelings you have towards that task that you're currently procrastinating on. Okay, so just spend like 1 second thinking, what are the thoughts or feelings you have towards that task? Okay. And then I want you to think of a task you're not procrastinating on, right? It's something you just go ahead and you do. The motivation is there. The progress is there. What are the thoughts and feelings you have towards the tasks that you're naturally motivated to do? If you write it down and you look at it, you will see that the tasks where you're procrastinating is because you have a negative mindset. You're like, does it really matter? Everyone is better than me at doing this. It's going to take so long. What's the point in even trying? What if I fail? What if it's not perfect? Those negative thoughts make you feel heavy. They make you doubt yourself, and then they make you retreat and procrastinate. Whereas if you're thinking, okay, I might not be the best at it, it, but I'm willing to give it a try. Like I have a clear vision of where I'm going and I'm going to believe in myself. Like even if I don't have the skills, I can learn, I can level up. That makes you feel confident. That makes you feel bold. And then you take action on it. So if you are procrastinating, if you're having a bad week where you're not making progress, you're not taking action on your goals, check the story you're telling yourself about the task that you need to do. Negative stories will keep you stuck. Positive stories will keep you moving forward. And that's why it's so important to work on building a positive mindset and to curate your week in a way that it boosts you having a positive mindset. Because when your mindset is positive, you're more likely to take action and move forward. When your mind is negative, if you're not doing your gratitude, if you're not reflecting on your strengths, if you're not honoring your different values, your mind is going to be really negative. And we all know once our mind is negative, we just go down a rabbit hole of negativity, and then that's the end of that. So it's so important to understand how your mindset affects whether you do something or you procrastinate.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that. I love that. I wrote one of the quotes down because I was like, positive stories. That's like me and driving right now because I just failed my driving test again for the third time. Anyway, I need a positive story about that. That actually is a nice segue onto growth mindset and resilience, because I do want to know what growth mindset means to you and how you put it into practice, because let's face it, a lot of the times the negative stories we're saying are because of a negative experience, right? So for example, like driving makes me nervous and is really scary. Or if I think of things I'm putting off at work, it's because I'm fundamentally not enjoying those types of activities. Like, oh God, I need to put off telling this client I can't work with them anymore. I need to put off this, that, and the other. So when I think of what growth mindset means to me and how I really put it into practice, I think it is almost just being reminded, despite the discomfort, of what those things are that I need to work on, even though they're undesirable or even though they're unpleasant. Like going for a run in the winter in the morning, even though it's cold and I don't really want to go outside, I had to remind myself, you're not going to regret it when you're 4 hours deep into Zoom later this afternoon. Like, trust me. So I guess the way I put it into practice is, again, almost sometimes I remind myself of something even more unpleasant than what I think this thing is, because I'm like, okay, the run is like less unpleasant than like back-to-back Zooms where I haven't left my flat. But yeah, I'm kind of just curious. Maybe I'll start with you, Michael, and then I'll come to you, Tiwalola. Like, what does that growth mindset mean to you? What does that look like in your work? How are you putting that growth mindset into practice and not staying fixed?
Yeah, it's something that I've tried to cultivate over the years. I think, so not to throw her under the bus, but my sister and I are kind of like the dichotomy of like growth versus fixed. I know she might be pissed that I'm throwing shade at her like that, but to me, everything was always like, I can never say the word figure outable. Like everything was always like, okay, I don't know this now, but you know what I'm saying? Man can figure this out like in a couple of weeks or a few books here and there. And actually how I started to learn to code is I went to a developer and I was trying to go on these websites and find like a, developer to outsource it to in India. And like the work wasn't that great. And I got probably finessed a little bit. So I said, how hard can it be to build a website? Like how bad can it be? So I went and got dummy HTML, CSS for dummies. And, I got popping with coding, and then slowly, then I went and did a computer science master's degree. And then that's how I kind of became a software engineer. But it came from the belief system that like, just because I haven't studied this before, and just because I'm, in my 20s and I haven't been doing this since I was 13, doesn't mean I can't do it. And I think that is the one mindset you have to try to cultivate. It might not come naturally to you, but you have to really make sure that you really believe that every problem to a certain extent is solvable, and everything that I need to learn, I can learn within reason. I'm not saying be a heart surgeon like next week, but those things, like that mindset matters. And my older sister, love her, but like it was always just like, oh, you can't do that. Oh, like, but what do I know about that? And oh, come on, like, but it's not me, that's not me. And I'm like, please, like, I wish I could give you the unjustified confidence that I have that you could like learn stuff, like take it. But it just, I don't know, it just wasn't to be. She's fine, by the way.
Thank you though for reminding us that you just have to try, like stopping at that doubt, like, oh no, it's going to be too hard, I just won't even bother, is guaranteed failure. Whereas as at least if you try, you might gain some little learning or some little success. And I'm just curious, Michael, when you first started coding and you were constantly getting bugs and all these kinds of things, were there any things that helped you stay positive and stay motivated? Like whether it was a mantra, whether it was reading stuff, whether it was listening to stuff?
So I would say it's an old school one. I had a role model. So I had a friend at uni, Tanzanian brother, and he basically taught himself to code like a year before me. So I had him there to kind of be like, okay, it's possible. Part of the reason why I built POCIT was because there wasn't, this is such a long time ago. This is like almost, I'm gonna age myself, like 10, 15 years ago. There wasn't that much resources where you could see someone that looked like yourself doing certain things. It was there, but you had to look really hard. YouTube wasn't really popping like that. There was no chat GPT where you could say, fix this bug. Maybe there was Stack Overflow, but it was still really, really early. So I had a role model. So role models are important, but you can also find them now online, books, podcasts, YouTube, like use all that stuff. So yeah, having somebody who's done what you've done in front of you, that's the ideal, but you can find that digitally now.
Amazing. Tiwalola, because you already shared some of the exercises and tactics from your book, which is amazing, by the way. Please get it if you haven't got one. If you can't afford a copy, I've got spare, so let me know. I'll bring one to when we hang out, founders. I wanted to ask you actually more around something you touched on earlier. So you talked at the beginning about how coming from Nigerian background and like wanting to succeed on the career ladder gave you this feeling that the corporate world would be almost more validating than the founder world, right? Before you went into it. So my question is really around how has your upbringing, your cultural background, all these things shaped your mindsets? And I guess in a way, like, how have you evolved from them? Because, you know, also in my book, one of the things that I talked about was my relationship with like fear of failure and rejection came from my parents, because they were like, if you come home with less than an A, I don't know where you're going to sleep tonight. And I was like, shit, okay, like that was their style of parenting. Yeah. So I think it was like genuinely founded in like fear. But as I became older, I was like, I don't need to subscribe to that anymore. Like, I'm my own person now. I'm my own adult now. And honestly, therapy really helped me also reset some of those mindsets, reset some of those attitudes, create my own unique ways of thinking. But I was wondering if you might be able to share, you know, how you have evolved just as you now, Tiwalola, the individual, versus Tiwalola 10 or 20 years ago, the daughter of parents, etc.
Yeah. Really great question. So I'm actually quite lucky because I come from an entrepreneurial and creative family. So it was me putting the pressure on myself to get amazing grades. It wasn't even my parents. It was just like growing up in the society in Nigeria, like it was the cool thing to be the smartest in the class type of thing. So that pressure came from me because I felt like because my parents are both creative, my sister's a fashion designer, both my parents are designers, my brother's a music producer. And it was like, oh, what's Tiwa good at doing? Like, I couldn't draw, I couldn't paint, I couldn't sing. So I was like, oh, the only thing I can do is do well in school as what I had to offer. So I put a lot of that pressure on myself to prove my worth by getting good grades. But actually, when I started my growth journey, I began to see that my parents were actually great role models because they showed me that there are no limits to who you can become and to what you can achieve. So I actually started to see that as something like really positive, that, you know, there's so much in me and there are no limits, there's no boundaries. I can unlock so much. And I actually went to in my year abroad, because I studied Spanish and management at university, I moved to Madrid for a year and I studied a fashion communications course. And I came out at the top of that course, like with like design and my creativity and my photography. And I started my own fashion label. And it was all of these things that I had been limiting myself that I couldn't do because I'm not the creative one. That creativity suddenly came out from within me. So from that background, I've gotten the idea like, okay, you actually have no idea what's inside of you. There is so many gifts and skills and talents, but you need to put yourself in those situations for those gifts to come out. Like your back needs to be against the wall to be like, there's no going back. This creativity needs to come. And I think it might not be creativity for you. It might be something else. It might be your financial acumen. It might be your strategic thinking. It might be your people skills. All of these skills, we have a lot of them inside of us, but we just automatically like disqualify ourselves because we think if we're not the best, then we don't have it. But actually, you do have it. Your strengths are not your strengths in relation to other people. Your strengths are your strengths in relation to you and the journey that you've been on. So that's what I'll say with that. But I also want to add, like, if you come from a background where people haven't supported you, maybe your parents haven't supported you, I think for me, the mindset shift that I always tell people is, listen, you know yourself more than anyone else. You are in your head, you live your life belongs to you. So don't let someone who only knows a snippet of you dictate your full potential. Like when teachers in school tell you, oh, are you sure you want to apply to all those universities? Or like when people say, oh, are you sure you're good enough to run this business? It's like they only know a snippet of you, they don't know the whole you. So don't let people who don't know all of you dictate how far your potential can go. You dictate that for yourself. And also, don't let one negative moment in the past define your whole lifetime. I always say failure is an event. It has a start date and an end date. Failure can never be your identity. You can never be a failure. Failure is something you experience and then you let go and you turn the page and you start a new chapter. So those really important mindset shifts, like knowing that you determine your identity, you determine your own potential, and what you think about yourself is so much more important than what anyone else thinks of you. So it's so important for you to carve out time to know positive things about yourself. Like I love what Olivia put in the chat about practicing your strengths, if you don't know your strengths, you can't back yourself. You don't know what you're made of. So it's so important to spend time creating that self-awareness, right? So when the negativity comes to try and knock you down, you can fight back, you can challenge it because you know who you are and you know what you're capable of doing.
Thank you. I love that. A lot of good advice there. I kind of wanted to come to you, Michael, with the same question as well. I feel like Tiwa, you were very kind to share sort of your family background and how a lot of your academic drive actually came from you trying to find your unique identity. And I really appreciate that. I guess my question again for you, Michael, is also around this idea of like the places in which we grow up, the communities in which we grow up. Sometimes a lot of these limiting mindsets are directly connected to that, whether that's because of how we've experienced the workplace, education, in the skin that we're in, or whether it's because of just the people that we're around and the lack of role model or the lack of representation. So I guess I'm asking you, how have you evolved to now be in the shoes that you're in, where you are running this business and you are a CEO and you believe in yourself in a way that maybe you did not when you first started? How are you able to move on from stereotypes in the community, limiting mindsets in the community, and how are you able to evolve your identity, and just be where you're at right now?
Yeah, I don't know where to begin. There's so many ways I can take that. I think a friend of mine actually was working on a book called -1, which is basically about not starting on zero. You're starting even beyond that. And even little cultural things can influence that. So for example, if you grow up probably in a more upper or middle class background, maybe in England, if you're at the dinner table, maybe mommy and daddy's going to ask you what little Timmy thinks. Timmy, what do you think about, what's going on in the world or the geopolitics? Whereas I kind of grew up in a culture where children were meant to be seen but not heard. So even down to when I got to university and we had to do presentations, I mean, I was my throat was getting dry. I was like, I don't think I could do this. I'm getting real nervous right now, basically. And I had to kind of be like, no, actually, what I have to say and matters. What I'm saying, at least to me. So there's value there. So those little things. The other thing is, my mom she did what she could. She raised me as a single parent, and I give her all the flowers and the blessing. Whenever I won an award, I'd always shout her out as my unofficial investor, because obviously she invested a lot of time, basically, even though there was no check. And she always kind of pushed safety first. So I remember having a conversation with her, and kind of her biggest aspiration for me was why don't you get a job at NatWest as a bank teller? You get to put on a suit. She worked retail, so the idea of putting on a suit and kind of having someone walk into a bank and seeing you, that to her was something for her son to aspire to. And I was like, Mom, I'm trying to be a millionaire here. This is think bigger than this. And to her, it was she couldn't fathom that. It was what are you talking about? Just go uni, etc., etc. And I did go uni. And again, I'm saying it all kind of worked out in the end. But I kind of chuckled because when I had a speaking gig one time, and I was like, oh, I had to just confess to her. I was like, look how much I'm like, they're paying me to come speak for like half an hour. Like, don't you remember like what you told me to be a bank? And that was back to her. Like, and she's like, no, but I always told you to work hard. So like, I get credit too. I was like, oh, okay. So that's basically success is, has many parents, and failure is an orphan, basically. It will happen. So even if your parents don't believe in you, once you make it, they will. More times than not anyway, unless they're haters. And then the final part about community. So I'm Eritrean, which is a country in the Horn of Africa, and we kind of like fought for independence for like many, many years. I'm actually older than my country. So when I was like 3 or 4, I remember us getting independence, and that kind of level of sacrifice. Everyone knew a family member that fought in the war and died, basically. Everyone had one. So it was like a very much like community-driven project, and everyone sacrificed. So it was very much about we and not I. And entrepreneurship is kind of inherently selfish, because not only are you kind of saying, I don't want to kind of have a job right now, I'm going to try and push this, and this might impinge upon family members. You're also probably not listening to your family. You're probably saying, I want to do this. And they're like, no, you should do this. So that was also something that I had to kind of unlearn and be like, this is all amazing and this is great and this is my heritage, but it's not me. Like, I have my own kind of story to write, and I had to let that go. So yeah, that's kind of like how my kind of, oh, actually one last thing. So growing up in London, so obviously I'm not just Eritrean and whatever, I grew up in London, and I remember being in the college library and going on internet forums, and people in my kind of college were like, oh, you're a nerd. Like, what are you doing on the internet? As crazy as it seems to believe, at one point, just being on the internet and somebody who kind of surfed the internet on your desktop, because it wasn't really on your smartphone like that at the time. It was like, you're a nerd. Like, what are you doing? And I had to really ignore the people that I grew up with, because I was like, I'm not trying to go where you're trying to go. And it did kind of work out that way, where they ended up in one place and I kind of ended up in another. I'm not trying to be arrogant, but like they look down upon nerdishness. They look down upon like doing things that would do with the internet. And sometimes you're going to have to, thankfully it's not as bad anymore. Everyone understands the value of technology. Everyone sees Mark Zuckerberg worth $1 billion. So now everyone's cool with being a nerd. But at one point it wasn't always that way. So whatever are kind of like the prevailing cultural norms about what you want to do, you probably are going to have to ignore them. That's just my thing about that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. A lot resonated with me as well. Also, people whose parents still want them to be lawyers or whatever. My parents still want me to be a lawyer. Like, no amount of clippings from the media will make them think differently. Here's a question from Zoe. When things have felt overwhelming, did you reduce your stimuli, or did you reduce your inputs? Was there ever a point where you were just like, there's actually too much info out there and I just need to like turn inwards? I feel like I definitely went on that journey after I got made redundant from Brandwatch. I like did the artist way, and I was like, everything I need to know is within my divine self. But yeah, I definitely went through that. But yeah, maybe Tiwa, have you been through that? And then Michael, I'd love to come to you with Jesse's question. What are the signs that an experiment hasn't worked and it's time to move on? But yeah, Tiwa, let me start with you. Have there been points where you just felt information overload, overwhelmed? And if so, did you reduce your content consumption? Did you minimize what you were taking in?
I'm trying to think. I think I'm not sure if I've ever like 100% felt like I'm taking too much in, mostly because I'm always giving it back out. So because for me, it's like, because I share like my knowledge and tips on building confidence online, it never feels like I'm just hoarding everything to myself. And I'm really good at being vulnerable with my community and being vulnerable online, even when I'm feeling overwhelmed and like I'm not sure which way to go. I'm okay to share like, oh, I'm in a season where I'm navigating things and I'm trying to figure this out. And I do this because I never want anyone to like come on my page and just be like, oh, she's so confident. Oh, she's so perfect. Like everything always goes according to plan, exactly the way she wants it. I actually have a highlights called my struggles, where I go on my stories and share some of my struggles that I'm experiencing. And I feel like that is a form of release, like when I'm really overwhelmed. And there's a difference between like being vulnerable and like oversharing. Right. So you've got to find that balance. But I feel like when I go online and I just share like, oh, my negative thoughts have really been kicking my butt this week, or like, oh, I'm really stuck on like a place where I don't know which direction to take. I find like speaking about it is almost like a form of like releasing and therapy, because when it's all in your head, you can't really see the pieces, but when you write it down or when you talk about it, you get more clarity. So the times I felt overwhelmed, I tend to talk about why I'm feeling overwhelmed as a way to like get clarity, or I write it down. And then I also always just make sure, kind of like when I'm sharing, when I'm learning stuff, I'm sharing my wisdom as I go along. And so I never have a point where it's like, oh, I don't want to listen to anyone or anything. I just need to sit with myself and quiet. And I mean, that works for some people. That's also important when your mind is too noisy and you just need to sit still. Absolutely. So I find writing is really helpful, and speaking to people about it. Never keep all your thoughts just stuck swirling in your head. When you put it on paper or when you speak it out loud, it's like you step back from it. It's like an outer body experience, and then you see it from a different perspective. So that's like one question I always ask myself, is like, how can I see this from a different perspective? And that helps me deal with the overwhelm.
Thank you. I was also going to suggest, Zoe, if you wanted to also chat more one-to-one about some of the work that I've done with like boundary setting, I'd be happy to chat with you, because there are also times where I've just like ignored all my friends' WhatsApps and messages, because I don't have the mental load to engage in this. So I can talk about that. Okay, so we are going to run over, but I don't want us to run over by more than 5 minutes. So if you have to go, that's fine. Please just fill out the feedback form. The recording will be made. But I just wanted to close with 2 questions for Michael. And then we're going to wrap up. The first one is Jesse's, which is, how do you know if your like startup experiment has failed and it's time to move on? But I also want you to answer Nikki's question, which is like, how do you know when it's time to go all in? Because I feel like they're like 2 sides of one coin. Like, how do you know when you're like, this is working, I need to give it more energy? But how do you also know this is actually just not gaining any traction, I need to move on?
So in terms of failing fast, or like, how do you know when it's not working? I always try to set a target for what I'm trying to achieve. So real world example, at my company POCIT, we've got like a website where we have articles, we've got like a job board where you can find work, but we're trying to launch like a paid community where, similar to like Chief, you can get like an elite network, you apply, there's going to be events, there's going to be like a forum, whatever. So in my mind, I'm saying to myself, we need to hit this many members by a certain date. Even just practically speaking, the person who I'm going to employ to help me with it, they have a salary which is X. If I don't get to like a certain membership level by a certain point, it's probably not going to work. And obviously the hard part about business is that it's part art, part science. So there is a science to it where you're like, okay, here are the numbers and this is what we need to hit for this to be sustainable. But it's also art where you're like, what is my gut saying? Are we realistically going to get somewhere? Because I've been in situations before where sometimes you wait and then all of a sudden the market just takes you up, but that doesn't always happen. So sometimes you have to also just go by your gut and be like, realistically speaking, are we even headed in the right direction? Like, do I see any traction? If there's no traction, you're giving it some good time and your target is nowhere near being hit, then I think you can safely kind of move on for now. So there's that. What was the second question? Remind me again.
Okay, cool. So if I, just to recap, you're working on some aspect of your business, you set the targets, you set the timelines, you set the goals based on the resources available. And if they're not hit, especially by a significant margin, you just go, okay, that is cut and gone and we're going to move on now. So then the only other question was, how do you know when it's time to throw yourself all in?
Oh, that's a difficult question. It depends completely on your situation. So I was living at home when I started my company, so I had a bit of a safety net. If you've got a job and you're trying to make that switch, I personally wouldn't go all in until I basically at least replace my salary to a certain extent, or I have a standard of living that I'm happy with. Like where I'm like, okay, I only need, I don't know what that number is, but like I need X. Have I got X? Okay, let's go basically. And that's why it's difficult. And that's why, there is an advantage to people who get funding, because they can just quit their job and straight away. And the fact that, POC and women don't get that much funding is also why probably, the unfairness in the world that Abba talk about on Techish. So it's a personal decision. And I would base it primarily on what do I need to get by and how much of that can I get from my business, basically.
Amazing. And just any other additions from you, Tiwa? How do you know when it's time to go all in?
Yeah, my story was quite different. So I had like only 3 months worth of savings, and I was like, I'm going to give myself like 3 months to make sure it's a sustainable business. And this was in December of 2019, and my 3 months was March of 2020 when the pandemic happened. And so as I was on my last bit of salary, all my potential income was completely wiped out the window because I was getting cancellations nonstop from all the companies that I had worked with. So you just never know. But how I knew it was time to go all in was because, there's this quote that's like, the pain of staying in the place becomes worse than the fear of like taking the leap, something along those lines. And it was like the pain of staying in my full-time job was getting too much. I started getting anxiety. Like your body will tell you when you've outgrown something. And so I started getting anxiety at work. I never ever get anxiety. I started getting anxiety. I could feel the tension in my body whenever I showed up to work. There was a lack of like energy and passion. It just wasn't there anymore. And that was my higher self telling me like, it's time to take this leap of faith and bet on yourself. So I had no business plan. I had no potential income lined up. I just knew that there was traction and I was going to take that leap of faith and see how it goes. So yeah, listen to what your body's saying. Listen to your intuition. You might not have all the answers, but one thing I love Michael said earlier is like, you can always figure it out. And my kind of motto is learning and leveling up. Like, no matter what I don't know, I can always learn. And when I learn, I will level up. So that's kind of how I knew there was tension in my body. And I was like, this pain of staying in this place, it's time to go, even though I didn't have it all figured out. But I'm team figure it out as you go along. So yeah.
I love that. There's a lot of courage in the room.
Yeah.
A lot of fuck it, I'm going for it, which I really admire. Well, thank you both, Michael and Tiwalola, for giving your time and also like such honest reflections of the entrepreneurial journey. Hopefully you're happy to connect with these amazing founders on LinkedIn and like keep supporting their journey. I know we're going to see you at the end of program dinner as well. So looking forward to hanging out then. But yeah, it's a wrap on today's session. Founders, please share feedback when you can. Thanks everyone. Have a good evening and I'll see the cohort again on Thursday. Bye.
Bye everyone.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Everyone.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Bye.